everybody. My name is Jerry Horsey, and I'm here representing the Board of Directors of the Theologian in Residence program, which is pleased to sponsor tonight's event. We're very glad to welcome Michael Baxter of DePaul University, who will be speaking on the U.S. invasion of Iraq, a Lenten memoir and meditation. Many of you know Jim Reed, and he is unable to be here with us tonight because his brother Robert yesterday entered the hospital and underwent a several-hour heart bypass surgery today. So I'd like to begin our evening tonight by just offering a few moments of silence in prayer for a safe and successful operation for Robert Reed and for Jim and the rest of the Reed family. And we wish Robert and the family well, wish him a speedy recovery as he begins a new life with a newly functioning heart. A couple of more mundane announcements. One is that I'd like to draw your attention to the inside of tonight's program, which tells you how, if you like tonight's program and would like to donate to TIR, we are a 100% donor-funded organization, and we're very grateful for the generosity that we are fortunate enough to have on an ongoing basis from many of you. I'd also like to mention, I hope you saw the flyer on the table out front on your way in. If you did not, please pick one up on your way out. The Larimer Chorale is having an April 6th concert, and the theme of that concert lines up really nicely with the theme of tonight's event. The main work that night that will be performed is Carl Jenkins' The Armed Man, A Mass for Peace. And the work combines traditional Mass texts with poetry and prayers from around the world. Representatives from a local nonprofit organization, Touchstone Health Partners, will be in the lobby that night of the concert, and they'll have information about their work assisting people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder, and concertgoers will have the opportunity to contribute to Touchstone. Concert details are on the handouts on the welcome table. Again, and you can also talk to Kathy Quinn. Kathy, raise your hand. She's one of the organizers of the event. If you have additional questions or are interested in the program, please talk to her after our event tonight. And now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Michael Baxter, who is a visiting associate professor at DePaul University in Catholic Studies. He is the author of more than 18 peer-reviewed articles and that many more or so other sorts of publications, book chapters, and the like. His new book, The Sign of Peace, American Catholics and American Wars, is under contract with Orbis Press. He's a widely sought-after speaker. If you look at the list of places he has spoken over the last decade or so, it ranges all over the map, from Georgetown to Baylor University, Duquesne University, St. Louis University, the Preparatory High School in Phoenix, the Episcopal Diocese of Western Missouri and Kansas City, and every place in between. Michael is also a creative and original mind. He studied at Duke University under the noted theologian of Stanley Hauerwas, and he has taught at Dayton University, University of Dayton, Notre Dame, and now at DePaul. And one of the things I've always appreciated about Michael's work is that he's not easily pigeonholed. He doesn't fit into simplistic and familiar liberal and conservative dichotomies, but he's an original thinker. He's open to new ideas, and he's seeking truth apart from what all the labels might mean, and I think you'll get a taste of that here tonight. But beyond being a prolific writer, speaker and a creative mind. Michael is also somebody whose faith informs his action as well. He's the founder, co-founder of a Catholic worker house in South Bend, Indiana, and he's the national secretary and board president of the Catholic Peace Fellowship. Tonight's address will discuss his reflections on his own experiences in ministry to both peace, on behalf of peace activism and ministry to combat veterans. Certainly things that go nicely together in Christian social teaching, but can easily be made to seem dichotomous in the secular world. So I'd like to invite you to silence your cell phones, sit back, enjoy. Join me in welcoming Michael Baxter.
Thank you so much.
And those of you who are veteran TIR goers know that we like to begin our talks with a prayer over our speaker. And the way this works, Michael, is we just invite you to raise your hands and offer up silently for Michael whatever prayer you would like to offer. Amen.
I feel like Pope Francis. Last night, that was quite remarkable. There'll be all sorts of things about him. Talk about people scouring your resume if you're a pope, you know. But boy, it was a moving moment when he just. And I was saying to Joachim on the way up from the airport that I teach Catholic studies at DePaul, and you know, these days I'm pretty clumsy when it comes to electronic things, but these days you have the computer, you have the TV, you can do everything in these classrooms. So it's the last day of the winter quarter, yesterday, and I said to my students in 1 o'clock class, look, we were going to talk about this book, but we're not going to talk about this book. We're going to watch TV. The white smoke just came up, and we're waiting for a pope. So we all watched it in the class. It was a great way to end the class. But anyway, I appreciate your thoughts and prayers. I appreciate being here. I am moving to Colorado in less than 3 months, and I lived here for 1 year back in 1979 and 80 in the Springs, and I am very glad to be coming back. I'll be living in Denver, and with plans to marry my fiance, who's going to be here at the end of tonight. She's giving a talk now too. Her name's Katie Glenn. I think she was here. She gave a talk on immigration at some point recently. I appreciate your comments. Although Stanley Hauerwas would say he's a little wary about the idea of being an original thinker. Stanley Hauerwas' line on that is, when you think you've had an original thought, it means you forgot where you read it. But I have so much I would love to say, and I want to especially talk, I'm hoping to have conversation, especially after my remarks. In particular on ministry to veterans, I had to stop at 45 minutes, and I would love to talk about that in our conversation, so please be mindful of that. And but I did want to take a journey through the past. It's been 10 years since the Iraq invasion. If you reckon it as having begun on March 19th, 2003. Some people might argue, and I'd be one of them, that it actually started in August of 1990. But at any rate, it seems to me that it's good for us to be mindful of that, because the history, like Mark Twain said, history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it rhymes, and we can see things developing. Just today on the news regarding Iran, the next door neighbor to Iraq. So I hope too we can discuss the most important question of all, which is, okay, so what do we do? You know, and how we respond personally, and I'd love to hear ideas. But forgive me, I'm going to take a kind of a personal walk down memory lane 10 years ago. I hope some of my experiences, you'll recognize them too, and it'll lead to a great discussion. Remember, it was called Shock and Awe. The original bombing. On March 19, 2003, Feast of St. Joseph for Catholics. At the time, I was in my room at Moreau Seminary at the edge of the campus of the University of Notre Dame, talking on the phone with a friend who was there in Iraq. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, South Bend time, 5 p.m., Baghdad time. We had been trying to get in touch with each other for several days, and I had all but given up hope of talking to her before the shooting started. So I was startled to hear the phone ringing, and then a soft-spoken voice saying something in Arabic, to which I responded, "May I speak to Kathy Green? One moment, please. I'll look for her." I pictured one of the Iraqi workers at the Al-Fanar Hotel, walking the hallways and peeking into rooms looking for Kathy. After a few minutes, Kathy came on the line. I said, "It's Michael Baxter." "Oh my God, you got through," she said. "How are you?" And then she explained that everyone in the Voices in the Wilderness delegation was holed up at the Al-Fanar Hotel now, along with friends nearby and the families of the employees at the hotel. "We all feel safer here together," she said. "Now we're just waiting. The word is that the bombing starts tonight." Kathy had been in Baghdad since the previous October as part of a group living and working in solidarity with people in Iraq. The name of the group was Voices in the Wilderness, taken from a line in the book of the prophet Isaiah, repeated in the Gospels. "A voice crying out in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord." The group had been formed by peace activists who, during the first Gulf War, established a presence on the Jordanian-Iraqi border, witnessing to peace, and who, in light of the sanctions in the U.S.-UN coalition imposed by them, wanted to do something more. So they started hosting delegations to Iraq. A dozen or so people, usually from the United States or the UK, who were to bring in medical and other supplies forbidden under the sanctions, to witness firsthand the horrendous effects of the economic sanctions on the people in Iraq, and to speak of the suffering there upon returning home to the United States. Kathy Green had traveled with several of these delegations over the years, but when she arrived in Iraq in October of 2002, she was already planning to stay on during the invasion. Kathy's decision to stay on did not surprise me. By that time, I had known her for 5 years. We met and came to know each other in 1998 when I visited the Catholic Worker in New York City. Kathy lived and worked in one of its 2 houses on the Lower East Side, Mary House, a 4-story walk-up that houses 30 people, both staff, to use a word that Catholic Worker staff people don't like to use, and guests, mainly women who come because they have nowhere else to go. The word guest doesn't apply either, though. Some of the women stay there for many years, decades. I got to know Kathy in long talks after dinner on the first floor of Mary House, which often continued well into the night around the corner at Dempsey's Tavern. I like Dempsey's Tavern because in my late 40s I got carded there. I wanted to know if I was We would talk about hospitality, the guests, the other staff, how to run the house, mutual friends, prima donna priests, boring bishops, the church, the world, the last judgment, the life to come. And amid our late night sessions, I heard Kathy's story. Born into an Irish Catholic family in South Philadelphia, educated by the nuns, a Catholic women's school for college in the late 60s, several years in an evangelical Christian community in Germany, 10 years in Bolivia as a Maryknoll missionary, as a nurse, community organizer, and advocate for the poor. Then in the 90s, back to the States and eventually to Mary House. I liked her. She was devout, dedicated, yet at the same time irreverent, in just the right measure. And she had a dark gallows humor to offset a dark and rather terrifying streak of spirituality so common among members of that peculiar tribe called Irish Catholic. You can see it on her face: blue eyes, light skin, dark hair, black Irish. And in her room, icons and rosaries on the tables, and on the wall, a crucifix with, of course, a corpus. Dorothy Day's presence can be felt at Mary House. Dorothy lived the last years of her life there. She died in her room on the second floor. She was waked in the chapel, where the Blessed Sacrament is still reserved, a privilege granted by the Archdiocese of New York under Cardinal Spellman. If one day Dorothy is canonized, people will be able to pilfer third-class relics from the Catholic Workers' Editorial Office because some of the pens and papers and so on are still there from Dorothy's day. Someone who's a saint who's touched them. Paper clips, various printed paraphernalia touched by the matriarch. But Dorothy's spirit is preserved at Mary House, as in the Catholic worker at large, not by devotion to Dorothy, we often make this mistake, but by devotion to the things to which Dorothy was devoted. Finding Christ in the poor, serving the poor at a personal sacrifice, knowing them personally, their names, their stories, their griefs and sorrows, their joys and hopes, to paraphrase Gaudium et Spes. Kathy's devotions runs in this direction toward personal love and service. And that's what brought her to Iraq in the fall of 2002 and kept her there throughout the spring of 2003. I'm still old enough to be astonished at how clear international phone calls are in this age of satellite technology. I'm one of those people who, when you're talking to someone long distance, you still raise your voice a little. No cracking or static or random beeps on the line. As I sit in my room at Royal Seminary, gazing across St. Joseph Lake to the Golden Dome glittering in the beautiful mid-March sun, Kathy brought me up to speed on how people in Iraq were doing. The voices of people staying on, who usually live in 3 different hotels, now all gathered together at the Al-Fanar, the staff at the Al-Fanar. And she would mention them by name, Amal and her children, whom Kathy had befriended. They were holding up in their little home. So too was Sitar and his brother, who were drivers for Voices, and as well as their family. And I asked, is Hassan around? He was the little kid who accosted every male entering and leaving the hotel. Mister, polish shoes? She didn't know where he was. Kathy caught me up on the people I met when I came to Iraq with the Voices delegation 3 months before. My traveling companion was Tom Cornell, a lifer in the Catholic Worker Movement and a founding co-director of the Catholic Peace Fellowship. During the 60s, Tom worked side by side with Dorothy as an editor of the Catholic Worker paper and served as her liaison to other groups in the peace movement. I met him in the early 80s while setting up a draft counseling center through campus ministry at Notre Dame. In the 90s, Tom and I were on a small team help U.S. soldiers who would come forward as conscientious objectors in advance of the first Gulf War. In the summer of 2001, with Tom's support and blessing, I and a few others at Notre Dame refounded the Catholic Peace Fellowship in order, this is our tagline, to support conscientious objectors to war through education, counseling, and advocacy. It was under the auspices of the Catholic Peace Fellowship that Tom and I went for 3 weeks to Iraq in mid-December 2002, up until early January 2003. We felt we just had to go. Tom sent me an email. Baghdad for Christmas? Could happen. That's how it was. And immediately I thought, yes. We went to meet Iraqi people, to make contact and pray with Iraqi Christians, to bring medical supplies and penicillin, to break the law, the embargo. And going to Iraq at that time was clearly enough to break the law, just going. Bringing medical supplies to Iraq was an added offense. We were warned that our trip could cost us penalties of up to $1 million and 10 years in prison. But we didn't take it seriously. Kathy Kelly and other voices people had been doing it for years, and that we figured the State Department had bigger fish to fry than us. Al-Qaeda operatives, terrorists of all sorts. Our intention was to return to the States and explain what we had seen and heard, as it says in the first letter of John. Who we had met, what they were going through, what havoc this war would bring to people that we know. These were the people that Kathy was catching me up on while on the phone that morning. At some point in our phone call, Kathy and I got to talking about her own safety. She didn't know what was going to happen. But we both knew that the presidential palace, a complex of immense buildings located just across on a vast tract of land surrounded by high walls and guards just across the Tigris River from the Al-Fanar Hotel. She could find herself in the line of fire, get hit by one of the bunker buster bombs that the government was bragging about. So we did what Catholics often do in such circumstances, at least if one of them is a priest, which I was at the time. She went to confession over the phone and got absolution right then and there. You know, you do what you can. Sacraments are astonishing, not only because they're signs that cause what they signify, or because they're Christ made visible in the church, but also because they provide us with something to do when we don't know what to do. You know, on the day that the bombing started in the first Gulf War, January 16th, 1991, I was at Duke University, and we had called a meeting for students who wanted to find out about conscientious objection in case there was a draft. With a week notice, we had more than 100 students there. Right at the end of the meeting, the bombing started. It was a Wednesday evening, as I recall. And as students left, the group of us who organized it didn't know what to do. So we said, well, let's go have Mass. So we had Mass. We just prayed. That's what Kathy and I did over the phone. We just prayed. And then she said, well, I better go. Because there was a lot to do and there wasn't much time. And so a minute later, I was off the phone. In Notre Dame, looking at the Golden Dome, glittering, and Kathy was there. My day was still before me. So I packed up my books and I went over to campus to play basketball, which was my routine, right? When in doubt, do your routine. Faculty, staff, students at Notre Dame, a bunch of guys from town. I always say the most integrated activity at Notre Dame. 3 days a week, 11:30 to 1, run hard and fast, good workout. I had other things in my even so, I could tell that the entire area around the presidential palace was being hit. That's what they wanted to do, Saddam. And that the Al-Fanar was not away, totally across the river. I watched for half an hour, listened to the news analysts, the same camera shots, the same commentaries, over and over and over again. So I went to my office after I watched TV at Notre Dame. I phoned Tom Cornell, told him I got through to Kathy. One thing was for sure, there'd be no talking to Kathy for a while. The U.S. invasion of Iraq was a long time in coming. In his State of the Union address in January 2002, President Bush identified Iraq as one of the three countries, along with Iran and North Korea, that forms an axis of evil in the world. In June of 2002, in an address to graduate cadets at West Point, President Bush made the case for what he called preventive war, a war deemed necessary, he argued, in order to neutralize aggressive rogue states before they have the chance to impose their tyrannical ways on other nations. Later that summer, the White House issued a summary of the Bush Doctrine on preventive war. By this time, officials in the White House had begun using the phrase regime change and ending states as the rationale for the invasion. In October of 2002, the administration called for joint approval in Congress of taking necessary steps in Iraq. An endorsement, vaguely stated, that was nicely timed 1 month before the midterm elections. And it passed overwhelmingly, with many votes extracted from the Democrats who had their eyes on future political prospects. After the new year, the Bush administration made the case for invading Iraq by arguing that the weapons inspections were not working, in spite of the objections of the UN Chief Inspector Hans Blitz. Late in January, Secretary of State Colin Powell went before the United Nations General Assembly to make the case for invasion. He had charts and graphs and photos. Then came the invasion, with the bombing on the evening of March 19th. In the Downing Street memo, which was made public many years later, it was revealed that the Bush administration had decided to invade in December of 2002. But in many respects, the decision came much earlier. In his book, Plan of Attack, Bob Woodward, editor and journalist for the Washington Post, who wrote the Watergate story, maintains that key officials in the White House began discussing options regarding Iraq on September 12, 2001, the day after the 9/11 attacks. But the invasion was in the making long before that date as well, I would argue. In 1997, a group of influential policymakers and public intellectuals founded an organization in Washington called, quite modestly, the Project for a New American Century. Its purpose was immodest as its name: to promote the leadership role of the United States in the post-Cold War era, and to make clear in the public forum that this goal will require a strong military presence in the Middle East. Founding members of the Project for a New American Century included Elliott Abrams, Jeb Bush, Dick Cheney, Irving Kristol, Louis Scooter Libby, Norman Podhoretz, Dan Quayle, and Paul Wolfowitz, a veritable who's who among neoconservatives operating inside the Beltline. Many ended up in the Bush administration. Two of them, Elliott Abrams and Scooter Libby, ended up in court, convicted of high crimes, although Libby was pardoned later by George Bush. The point is that the Al-Qaeda attacks on 9/11 gave this cohort, who had all been hired by Bush, an opening to make good on their long-standing plan of establishing a dominant military presence of the United States in the Middle East. heard seemingly intelligent people make this argument, but I find it implausible, irresponsible, and unnecessary in making the case against the invasion. What I am proposing is that when events unfolded the way they did, with Al-Qaeda operatives bent on creating mayhem in our country, these neocons in government, in the press, and in the DC think tank network configured these events so as to justify what they were certain should be done anyway, and would be done if they had something to say about it, and as it turned out, they had a lot to say about it. And to make what they had to say convincing, they recruited the best and the brightest. Take, for example, Kenneth Pollock, a Yale graduate, MIT PhD, and the author of the influential article, Next Stop Baghdad, published in Foreign Affairs in the spring of 2002. And then published later that year a book-length argument called The Gathering Storm, The Case for Invading Iraq. Pollock argued that although the link between Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Al-Qaeda is tenuous, the United States should invade anyway, because sooner or later, for the sake of regional stability and to rid the country of weapons of mass destruction, Saddam Hussein would have to be removed. It was a matter of, Pollock put it in his conclusion, of not whether, but when. And the answer was soon. It was a classic realist argument, complete with analogies to the year 1938 and the failure of the nerve of the British and French, to Cold War deterrence and how that would never work with Saddam. And it had an epigram in the beginning of the book of the poem, The Second Coming. Anarchy is loosed upon the world, the blood-dimmed tide is loosed, the ceremony of innocence is drowned, as Yeats's rough beast, glibly identified as Saddam, once more, quote, slouches toward Bethlehem. The image is ominous, in much the same way that Condoleezza Rice's mushroom cloud and Colin Powell's photos of yellow cake nuclear materials were ominous. Not whether, but when. As anybody now knows, no usable weapons of mass destruction were found. As this became clear after the invasion, one critic asked if a scholar like Pollock can be sued for malpractice. Or perhaps the Ellen Foundation, which funded him, should ask for its money back. But the Ellen Foundation didn't do that because they got their job done, which was to justify the invasion of Iraq by whatever means necessary: subterfuge, slogans, advertising, shades of Machiavelli and Thomas Hobbes. There were, you may recall, stout-hearted opponents of the invasion, people whose words were important to read: Chris Hedges, Andrew Bacevich, David Courtwright, many others, Howard Zinn. You may also recall that a strong movement for peace sprouted up in the United States in the months leading up to the invasion. On February 15, 2003, one of the largest peace demonstrations in the history of the world was held in Washington, D.C. and other nations around the globe. And my friend, Tom Cornell, a traveling companion, he said, in the early days of Vietnam, there was never anything like this. The level of dissent. But I must confess, I felt helpless at the time. I thought that all these efforts would be to no avail. The cards had already been dealt, the die already cast. Writers as various as Homer and Herodotus and Tolstoy and Zola, and the 19th century philosopher of modern war, Karl von Clausewitz, depict war as a set of uncontrollable events, like a force of nature, a wind or a fire, or a chemical reaction, uncontrollable, or like animals in uncontrolled gallop or herd. Herd, that's the image that Randolph Bourne, and a writer in World War I, said happens when the state goes to war. The population becomes a herd. And that's what I saw happening after 9/11 with the Afghanistan war, and even more so at the invasion of Iraq. So I didn't hold out much hope for changing the course of events in the United States. I did hold out some hope, however, for perhaps getting something different to happen in the churches, including my own church, naturally the Catholic Church. And there was something different. In September of 2002, Cardinal Ratzinger, then the head of the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith, and now our Pope Emeritus, stated that the Bush doctrine of preventive war is nowhere in the Catechism. Imagine, I detect a little cynicism. Cardinal Sodano, the Vatican Secretary of State at the time, all these guys with their hats were on TV yesterday, expressed serious reservations about the plan to invade Iraq. So did Cardinal Martino, President of the Pontifical Commission on Justice and Peace. And so did the Pope, John Paul II, in his New Year address, calling world peace, calling war always a human failure. These, I found, hopeful developments. Ever since the summer after the First Gulf War, the posture of Rome had been increasingly critical of U.S. war-making, suggesting in one official newspaper, La Civica Cattolica, that the nature of modern war was rendering just war theory obsolete. Now, a similar skepticism was being voiced in the run-up to the Iraq invasion. In order to do our little part in helping to solidify the skepticism of those in the Vatican, after leaving Iraq in January 2003, Tom Cornell and I stopped in Rome to meet with any officials in the Vatican who would see us. And they saw us. We were received graciously by Cardinal Martino, who shared our concerns about Christians in Iraq, 1 million of them, and how we passed on stories of how they're convinced that after the invasion, there will be no room for them in this country. Warranted fears, as it turned out. We conversed with assistants to Cardinal Stafford, who's a local dignitary in the church, head of the Commission on the Laity, who was concerned about the United States march to war, and those Catholic theologians and intellectuals who were justifying it. And we met with an academic friend of mine, Gus Denoyer, who worked at the CDF and the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, who listened politely to what we had to say, although he begged off making any formal response out of fear, I think, for how we might use it in the press, because we would use it in the press if we had the opportunity. He was right to be apprehensive about that. We felt we owed it to the people that we had just left in Iraq, who were, I feel like, they were like people on the Outer Banks in North Carolina with a hurricane being forecast. You know, that force of nature. Although we make the hurricane, don't we? Not the winds of Pentecost, the hurricane. Our most invigorating conversation, though, came not with cardinals, but with people at Sant'Egidio, a community in Italy that has mediated between warring factions in countries throughout the world. We met with the people that started that community one night after evening prayer, attended by hundreds of people in Rome, and led entirely by lay people, chanted. A lay person gives a homily, 10-minute homily every night. Goes for about 40 minutes. And then we gathered in a nearby flat for pizza, wine, storytelling, a night of camaraderie and a mutual concern for peace. So leaving Rome, I was hopeful. Born out of the sensibilities, I think you could say, of a universal church. A universal church. Not an American church, not a national church, but a universal church. That is to say, a Catholic church in that sense of the word. But upon returning to the States, the sensibilities that prevailed were those of a church all too American, all too natural, and in that sense, sectarian. By no means did this surprise me. For years I had been studying the ways in which the Catholic Church in the United States had subordinated itself to the authority of the nation state, a pattern that I and other scholars call Americanism. Historically speaking, the Americanist tradition, as I conceive of it, started in the 19th century with the figures Orestes Bronson and Isaac Hecker, and it was continued at the turn of the 19th century in the so-called Americanist movement, headed up by James Gibbon and Archbishop John Ireland of Minnesota. But it really consolidated in the time of the First World War, when the Catholic bishops in the United States formed the National Catholic War Council. This history doesn't get told. The purpose of the War Council, as it was called, was to mobilize Catholics in support of the war effort and to assist the nation in war relief and social reconstruction, as it was called at the time. The purpose was fulfilled with monumental success. You can read about it all in a book entitled American Catholics in the War, the National Catholic War Council, 1917 to 1921. The book was published in 1922. And the author of the book was Michael Williams, who worked for the press department of the National Catholic War Council. Interestingly, after he finished his work at the War Council, Michael Williams went out to start a new lay Catholic journal called, at the time, The Commonweal. And he remained as its founding editor until the mid-30s. As for the War Council, its mission was redefined and expanded, and in 1921 it was renamed the National Catholic Welfare Council. And then in 1922, for ecclesiastical jurisdictional reasons, it was renamed the National Catholic Welfare Conference, which name it retained until 1965, when it became the National Conference of Catholic Bishops and the United States Catholic Conference, until it was renamed yet again, not long ago, the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops. Thus, the USCCB, the most authoritative standing organization of Catholic bishops in our country, has its origins both structurally and conceptually in the National Catholic War Council. These are not merely fun facts in American Catholic trivia, although I love American Catholic trivia. They reveal the extent to which the Catholic Church in the United States has taken on as its central agenda to provide a social and political ethic for America. This, it must be said, has led to important challenges to the nation. One thinks here of the many pastoral letters on economics and fighting for workers' rights and civil rights and the rights of the unborn and the elderly and the infirmed. But at the same time, this has also led to a pattern of accommodation and domestication of the church to the injustices that have been part and parcel of life in America, in the United States. And in no area has this conformity to the nation-state been more evident than in waging war. The Americanist tradition has been crucial in maintaining this pattern. It envisages the United States as a specially chosen nation, providing the Catholic Church with the freedom it needs to carry out its mission of bringing peace and freedom and justice to the nations of the world. We Catholics, therefore, owe our loyalty to America. Church and nation are melded into one, like body and soul, and we Catholics have a dual allegiance to both God and country. And throughout the 20th century, this dual allegiance displays itself, especially in time of war. In the First World War, against the tyranny of the Kaiser. In the Second World War, against the fascist foes. During the Cold War, with the Christian West set against worldwide atheistic communism. And in much the same way, in the War on Terror, it has been cast in terms of a rivalry between the West, often the Christian West, the Christian Democratic West, and the implacable foe of Muslim extremism, Islamism, Islamofascism. The most influential exponent of this latest phase of Americanist ideology has surely been George Weigel, columnist for some 60 diocesan papers. You know, they say you can figure out the appointment of John Paul II bishops by the diocesan newspapers that have replaced the column of Richard McBrien with the columns of George Bryan. He's the author of many books, including Witness to Hope, the biography of Pope, this big, and then a sequel to it. In the fall of 2002, Weigel argued that the Iraq invasion was necessary to preserve order in the region. To those who argued that the just war tradition disallowed preventive wars, as Ratzinger had just suggested in September, Weigel countered that the just war principles had to be adapted to new circumstances of rogue nations and non-state actors. He also asserted that in the final analysis, it is the president's responsibility to make the call, not the religious and academic leaders of the nation who claim a false moral authority. He even went so far as to bestow on the presidential office the charism of statecraft, a fanciful notion that was roundly criticized by Rowan Williams and which was eliminated from further published drafts of Weigel's original lecture. In protecting the decision to invade from Catholic critics, Weigel also argued that going to war against Iraq was not a matter of a moral principle, but, we've heard this phrase before, prudential judgment, and that good Catholics could differ on the war. Fair enough. Good Catholics can do, good people can do. But Weigel never got around to explaining why his prudential judgment, and Bush's, was the right one, and why Ratzinger's and John Paul II's was the wrong one. In any case, Weigel's prudential judgment on the invasion of Iraq was predictable, for he too, in addition to the rogues gallery I mentioned before, had been a long-standing political realist in the tradition of Reinhold Niebuhr. He too was a hardline Cold Warrior in the 80s and early 90s. And he too was a founding member of the Project for a New American Century, who believed that some way would have to be opened up for the U.S. to establish a dominant military presence in the Middle East. The underlying logic and rationale is dry and detached. In geopolitical terms, the collapse of the Soviet Union has caused a power vacuum that in the Middle East that the United States must fill for the sake of stabilizing the region. A lot of times when my students say, what do you think the cause of the Iraq War, the invasion of Iraq was, I say the fall of the Soviet Union. Weigel overlays this logic, not with the cold phrases of ending states and regime change, but with the language resonant of the Catholic tradition, what he calls the classic just war tradition, prudential judgment, the tranquility of order, a phrase of Augustine's that Weigel has ruined forever. I was aware, in coming back after the Iraq invasion, or coming back to the United States after my visit to Iraq, of this history and tradition, the weight of this Americanist discourse, one might say, and the way that it would militate against the possibility of Catholics in the United States resisting Bush's decision to invade Iraq. So, in the face of this history, I did what academics do. I gave talks, mainly about my trip to Iraq during the previous Advent and Christmas, about the Iraqis I had met, about the Muslims in Iraq, and how there were actually differences between Sunni and Shia, how Saddam Hussein was using Islam as a way to consolidate his power, how he would eliminate any religious fanaticism that threatened to undercut his authority, how everyone feared a civil war should Saddam be deposed. I talked about the 1 million Christians in Iraq, how we celebrated Christmas Eve Mass in a Chaldean Catholic church in Basra with the bishop there, Gabriel Kassab, who had 7 brothers and sisters living in Detroit. how these Christians in Basra heard the same gospel proclaimed on Christmas Eve as we did here in the States. How they had a Christmas pageant right in the middle of their liturgy, with teenagers playing the roles of Mary and Joseph, and they had a beautiful live olive-skinned, almond-eyed little infant baby playing the role of Jesus. They brought him out, the little baby, for their Christmas pageant, and 300 people in the assembly just go, "Oh." And then afterwards, a homily about peace. Bishop Gabriel Casson. And then after that, after the collection, see, it's a universal church. After the collection, up from the middle aisle, coming up the aisle, a guy with black boots, red suit, big belly, white beard and hair, rattling and singing jingle bells, and getting all the kids to sing jingle bells in Arabic. I talk about how theirs are some of the most ancient Christian communities in the world, traditionally founded by Thomas on his way to India. How they're proud of the Chaldean Rite liturgy, which is in Aramaic, the language of our Lord, they would say. In telling these stories, I was trying to humanize the so-called enemy, to personalize the way that we think about Iraq, to underscore that people in Iraq are members of our same body, brothers and sisters in Christ, children, all of them, of the same Father. This is what I felt Kathy Green was demonstrating dramatically with her life by staying on during the invasion of Iraq. War generates drama. And the drama we usually get placed in by the media, by politicians, is that of nations and empires, rising and falling. Big words like freedom, security, stability, prosperity. Big ideas like regime change and ending states. The big picture. We get trained to think like the big policymakers on Sunday morning talk shows. Like the president as he boards Air Force One. Like, as I tell my students, little talking and walking heads of state. When they say in my class, well, what should we do about Saddam? That's our question. Who do we mean by we? What are we doing? We Christians, we Americans, are we going over there to fight? Kathy Green played in a different drama, a different role. A drama enacted side by side with Amal and Hassan and Satar, our driver, with other people that she knows personally who don't make the news. When she saw every day face to face these people, a realist would say she needs to see the big picture. But in another sense, I want to suggest she sees the big picture in their faces. In their faces, the face of God. As the psalmist says, show us your face, O Lord. And as for the realists, it is also written in the Psalms, they arise, the kings of the earth, princes plot against the Lord and his anointed, but God who sits in the heavens is laughing them to scorn. Words like these were assuring to me during the weeks and months after the invasion of Iraq. All the images that we saw on television, the statue of Saddam being toppled, staged, only a block away from the Alphenar Hotel. The heroism of Jessica Lynch, which turned out to be fabricated. The looting throughout Baghdad, which U.S. troops were ordered not to interfere with. The frantic search for weapons of mass destruction, which never appeared. And the video hanging of Saddam, broadcast around the world. And then the final word from President Bush in May of 2003, that the war has been won and is over. Tell that to the deployed soldiers who went there for the next 8 years. Once, twice, 3 times. He announced that from an aircraft carrier, wearing a flak jacket, anchored off San Diego, California. Also dramatic, also staged, all validated with a vivid blending of what Augustine called civil theology and fabulous theology. A theology of state and theater. Though now not used for the false peace of the Pax Romana, criticized by Augustine, but the false peace of the Pax Americana. I didn't see Kathy again until after President Bush told us that the war was over. It was the summer of 2003 in New York when we met one afternoon. She told me the whole story over time. On the day the troops marched into Baghdad and came up to the Alphenar Hotel, the guys got out of their all-terrestrial vehicles and said, "What the hell are you guys doing here? These Americans. Who are these nutcases?" Kathy got talking to one soldier from Buffalo, New York, who had made the walk and ride from Baxter to Baghdad, and who was engaged in especially heavy fighting in Fallujah. "I've seen terrible things," he said. "I've seen terrible things." And he told the story of killing a little girl at a checkpoint by mistake, the same age as his little girl back in Buffalo. Kathy said it was like hearing confession. Kathy Green returned to the Catholic Worker that summer. She had a lot to answer for. The community at the Catholic Worker is very unforgiving, if even for the most heroic reasons you absent yourself from what they call the work. In fact, they say, especially for heroic reasons, heroism is frowned upon in the Catholic Worker. But at length, Kathy Green, her life took a rhythm that continues to this day. 6 months, 8 months in New York, 6 months, 3 months in Baghdad. Or when they had to leave, her friends had to leave Baghdad, in Amman, Jordan, where they fled. Or to Mosul, up in the north, Nineveh. Or to Damascus, where they are now, many of them. Trying to encamp on a border that is falling apart, if you read the paper just yesterday. She's staying connected to the people there that she knew in Baghdad, getting them visas, helping them take care of their kids, trying to get them resettled, perhaps in the United States or wherever is possible. She's going to Nasiriyah again, as she did this past fall, in May. She needs money for the trip, not to compete with TRR. But I will give her a direct statement. I'll give her what, pass on what I have. For my part, I've never forgotten her story about the soldier. I've seen terrible things. I think of my dad and how he had nightmares during World War II. He served in World War II and had nightmares 2 years before he died in 1992. once a listener. And it turns out I have had several veterans in my classes. 550 student vets at DePaul University. And I wonder how many are here. I'm sure a lot. I talked to one student vet who said to me, "Thanks, we just need the sense that someone wants to hear me." At that. Moral injury is a concept that even the VA has now adopted. Soul repair. The difficulty of coming back from war. And the importance of the works of mercy, the words of Christ. Inflicted, suffered, healed, saved. Think of Lent and what we celebrate this time of year. 10 years ago, this coming week, the invasion of Iraq. The repentance, I think Lent calls us to, is what you could call a change in epistemology, in the words of John Tiernan, who's written powerfully on the death of civilians in Iraq. Placing ourselves in that drama of salvation, I think alongside of Kathy, at the foot of the cross. Or perhaps even the soldier who pierced the side of Jesus and who needs healing. Or the soldier especially, who says in the Gospel of Mark, "Surely this is the Son of God." Thank you. For the most part, not, but I'm sure there were some, but mostly not. The Christians had this funny relationship with Saddam where they had to appease him, because if they ever felt, if they ever started speaking their mind about what was happening under Saddam, they'd be gone. They'd be dead. Make no mistake, Saddam was a tyrant. I really, you asked a good question, and I'm not sure of the percentages of Christians who were Baptists, but they're considered to be outsiders in the sense that most of Iraqis are Muslim, either Sunni or Shia, and they don't fit that equation. Even though they would insist we were here before Islam even existed. So they feel like they're the real founders of the country. But their relationship was at some distance. They kind of stuck out. Mainly located in the north, in Mosul. Many French-speaking, founded by French Dominicans, ministered to by French Dominicans. Yes, sir.
You said you have about 550 veterans at DePaul.
Yeah.
Here at CSU, there are about 840.
No kidding.
Yes.
Student veterans.
Yes, student veterans. That is correct. Yeah.
I take it there's a veterans organization group to...
It's CSU Student Veterans Organization, yes. Yeah.
What types of activities do they do?
I don't know, but I'm going to be having dinner with some of them in about 3 weeks, so I'll find out and get back to you.
I would love to know that. I have just found that people are very, unlike the generation of my dad, and maybe even Vietnam generation, a lot of the veterans now are more open to talking. Everyone's encouraging them to talk. Open up. It was kind of cool of silence around. The way I think of it is, if you've been to the land of war, only other people that have been there can really understand. But that creates a kind of isolation. It takes a long time to come home.
There are still many I work with World War II and Korean War veterans as a volunteer, and many of them are World War II. The war's been over more than 60 years, and many of them are having great difficulty in opening up today. In fact, some of the folks in here know that I'm involved with what we call Honor Flight in Northern Colorado. It's part of a national network. We're taking World War II veterans to Washington, D.C. to visit their monument, their memorial, and at no cost to the veterans. And one of the fellows I escorted 4 years ago, upon returning, a couple of weeks later I called him and said, how are things going? And he said, Dick, you'll never know how much this trip means to me, because I was in combat for 18 months in Italy. I couldn't cry when my buddies were getting killed. I came home, got married, had a normal life. My wife died 10 years ago. My grandkids said, Grandpa, why can't you cry? And he said when we went to the memorial there in Washington, and I'm sure you've been there, he said he began to weep, and now he says, I can now experience that emotion. So Honor Flight gave me that part of my life back.
Right. I'm teaching a course next quarter called Coming Home from War. And we're going to see Saving Private Ryan. Which is a similar type experience, I think it's important to honor the experience and the feelings people have, and yet not to say, so therefore war is okay. Which I think some people slip into that cliche, or we have to honor that sacrifice, and to pick apart that in detail, and to get to how people really feel, is something I'm interested in doing more of. I've been reading it and talking a little bit about it the last few years.
What sense do you make of the record suicide or PTSD of troops coming back? Have you put that into your own thinking?
A little bit, although I want to open this up too, but what I think, here's one theory. I'm not getting this from myself, but there's no original thoughts, right? I think that one thing that happens in the military is that people are put in a position where they're to fulfill a role. And a lot of people join to fulfill the role. And in a lot of ways, the role is a good one for them to fulfill. You get empowered. Through the training, which sometimes is brutalizing and inhumane, and through the camaraderie, they learn all that it would take to go to war, and then go to war. And then come back here to the States. And people, I think more so than in the past, really don't get it. Not only that, people are going for multiple deployments, and people are returning quickly, so that you can be in Carangal Valley on Wednesday, and you can be on College Boulevard, or wherever's here in Fort Collins on Sunday at Wendy's. And those are two different realities. And I think what happens is that it's natural for people then to fragment and compartmentalize those experiences. experiences. So there are whole parts of oneself, maybe that goes to that story, which you just push aside. You can't, as you're going through it, mourn the loss of a friend who's been killed sitting next to you. Like my dad's friend, Cain was his name, was killed in Italy. So you stuff it, and there it stays. And and wives and husbands now come back and they say, my soldier husband is just not the same. He's a different guy. And the soldiers that come back, it's not the same at home. There's a guy, Jonathan Shea, who wrote a great book, 2 books, one called Achilles in Vietnam, and another called Odysseus in America. And he worked with Vietnam vets, and his idea is, a lot of these guys aren't the kind of guys, or mainly guys in Vietnam, but not entirely, but mainly, are not the kind of guys who are going to sit there and open up before a counselor and start crying. Oh yes, you're right. And so they're just not that type. And so he's a counselor, and so what he decided to do was to get people reading the Odyssey, which is a story of a soldier coming home from battle. And they would read little parts of it, he would talk about it, and then they'd start telling their stories through the lens of that classic. And it was a way for people to really name their experiences. Everything from the drugs, there's not drugs in the Odyssey, women, relationships with women, all the things that family, like Penelope has other suitors after her, when Odysseus comes out on the sea, and so on. So it really they found it very rich and powerful. That type of thing has this integrating effect, and I think that's the challenge of all of us, though, right? In modernity, we're all told how to be one person at home, one person at work, another person at church. Philosophers talk about the moral fragmentation of modernity, and the task is to become integrated and united within, and it takes a lot of work. So veterans go through struggles that we all do, and I've had veterans tell me that that's what they need to hear. That I'm not different because I'm a vet. We all have the same challenges. So, in some sense, what you want to do is break through the soldier-civilian divide. Yeah.
I teach veterans at CSU, and I wondered if you have any practical advice about how to integrate combat veterans into the classroom, into a classroom that might be made up, or almost certainly is made up of non-veterans. Do you have any tricks of the trade I can borrow?
I'm new at this. I have some hunches, but like next quarter, we're on the crazy stupid quarter system in DePaul, so I have 10 more weeks to go this spring, and so we start a new quarter in 2 weeks. And it's going to be coming home from war. And it's going to be mainly non-vets, but I don't know, but I've tried to get some vets coming in too. It's a big class, so there might be 5 or 10. It's interesting. This semester I taught the War on Terror, and I had 4 vets, 4 out of 25. And these guys are one guy's special ops, 2 deployments to Iraq, 1 to Afghanistan. A Marine, 2 deployments to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan. I had a ex-wife of a veteran, and part of her story was coming home from war. She's crying, talking about one day in class. People open up. I guess my one advice is to keep it non-ideological in both directions. Not to, I'm a peacenik. I admit it, I love Dorothy Day and I'm a peacenik and whatever, and all that, but I don't wear that on my sleeve in class. They know where I stand. And I give them some things I've written. But we don't, I really try to not push that agenda, but let's just talk about the reality of it. And on the other hand, to celebrate it, nice job over there. Way to go, thank you. Yes, it's healing in some respects, but that is not the level of healing that's needed. You know, the ticker tape parades. Like one girl in my class, one young woman said to another guy who had been in one of these meetings, "Thank you for your service." And he just looked. And he just looked a little bit stupefied. And I said to him, I said, "So what do you think when people say that?" And he goes, "I don't know what to say." And he was over in Cornwall Valley for 15 months. Thanks. Thanks. We'll never be the same. Way to go. We had to do a job. Okay, I mean, I don't want to denigrate the intentions of that, but it's not what needs to happen. And the veterans find that people don't want to hear what happened.
Everything that's said here is nice, and I think the country as a whole has a problem in that right now we're beginning to talk Iran, like we're going to it's just going to send a bunch of airplanes over there and bomb it. And this whole warfare has changed in ways presented to the public. Now you see a bunch of crosshairs and a missile hit something. And that's it. It either destroys the building or kills those people only. But we don't see the soldiers who are usually on the ground and follow up the mess they go through. The last time we saw that was during Vietnam. You had, who's that? CBS, not Walter Cronkite, but the other groups from CBS News. On the day, every night, they'd be at some battle. It was sensitized to a degree. You didn't see the guy get hit, but you saw them getting airlifted out. You saw them on the stretchers. We don't see anything like that at all. And so we're so sensitized. Like my parents would talk about and see the honeymooners, Art Carney. And they say every so often, did you notice he limped? Well, why did he limp? Because we were shy at the moment.
Is that right?
Yes. Or you turn around, Marshall Dillon from Gunsmoke. Didn't like riding a horse, had to play that role because he was also hurt during World War II. You had Clark Gable riding in the back of a bomber. And so all the population was involved. And people would talk about the war. Now it's so, well, it's just these few guys who are unfortunately on their third, fourth, fifth tours. And we're paying them a lot of money to do that. So consciously, we look at them as, what you call the old Germans that came over here, the Hessians, and nothing but mercenaries. We have to send mercenaries to do it. And so a whole society has gotten to accept war almost like ancient times. It's just a way of living.
You know, what you say is even said by Robert Gates. There's not a whole lot I agree with by Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, but one thing he said recently was, well, America doesn't go to war, the military goes to war. America doesn't go to war, the military goes to war. America doesn't want to know about it. And, you know, so I was taught to ask the question that I posed when we say things like, what should we do about Saddam? My teacher at Duke said, you should say, who do we mean by we? That's always an important question. And, you know, one question that we have to ask ourselves is, do we mean we Americans or we Christians? Good point. But there's an added sense we should reflect and stumble over that question. Who do we mean by we when, let's say, George Will gets up on ABC Sunday morning and says, well, we should do this in Iraq? I want to say, are you going to do it?
No, because he never
pacifists are often said, well, you guys sit in your ivory towers. And I want to say, you know, we're all kind of removed. But in another sense, this hidden history indicates we're not. Because right now, if we said, who has a person close to them, a family member, who's been affected by war, I dare say 90% of us would stand up. So it is us, all of us. Yes?
It's been implied in some of the things we've been talking about lately, and that is the change in the early 1970s to a volunteer army.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts on, I mean, some of the thinking I've been doing on it is that it's kind of obvious how much isolating that is, and what a relief it is for the rest of the population.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. I mean, I don't.
Well, it's almost a cliche, but people, if there were a draft, there would be a very widespread anti-war movement right now. And, you know, we're naturally self-interested, but not to condemn anyone, but if there were a draft, the students at DePaul, all of them, would be thinking about it in ways that they're not going to think about it now unless they've enlisted. And what they call now, the setup now is they call it the poverty draft. You know, that people, not entirely, but people, the very well-to-do don't ordinarily join up. Some do, you know, some officers go to the academies or whatever. But the very well-to-do don't enlist to be E1, E6 privates or whatever. A lot of guys, people join to get out of the neighborhood. A lot of them want to become better, and I think in many ways they do become better. There's a lot of moral formation that goes on in the military, and some of it's good. You learn to do stuff. You learn you can do stuff. So people get their meetings there. So I feel like then the recruitment process is very questionable in many cases. A lot of stories of false promises. In my work in the Catholic Peace Fellowship, we have always had a staff member serving on what's called the GI Rights Hotline. And it basically is you have a number in any GI anywhere around the country. You get different regions. We have like 20 or 30 lawyers and counselors from around the country. You can call this number and you get everything. From, I can't get my physician to see me and I think I have a disorder. My commander tells me that I'm getting screwed on my wages, or they're putting a stop-loss order on me. Everything in the military comes through these phones. And it's unbelievable. Just the chaos. I mean, just think of a lot of it. It's like, you know, if you're a commander, say you're 30 years old commander, you're basically having to take care of a bunch of kids. 18, 19, 20, you know, and, you know, for a year or two, it's a lot. There's gang activity in the military, like on board aircraft carriers, there's racism, and all the sociology that we have in our society, it makes its way in there. So it's really chaotic. I just wish I got involved with Steve Hannon and Bill Derlin down in Colorado Springs back in the early 80s when they started the draft registration. That's how I got started in all this, and we just wanted people to stop and think about what they're doing. And that's why I have my students read, I want to recommend a few books and movies. The Good Soldiers by David Finkel. I had a guy, tough guy, special ops guy, say this is how it is. The Good Soldiers. You can get it, it's everywhere. A great movie, Restrepo. An hour in Restrepo, R-E-S It's a documentary. It goes about an hour and a half. A small unit, a company in Afghanistan for 15 months. And it is a powerful and good movie. It's non-ideological. You know, but you get to fall in love with these guys, and they just come back dazed, you know, and different. It's good. It's just realism. In this sense, I want to be a realist about war. Here's what happens, and I want to talk about my dad and how he didn't talk about it.
A couple of things. Well, and feel free to pass if you've already answered this, but I would take a question about our distance from the military and say that it comes together. I think the churches are even more distant from the military than the general population. And yet, at least once a year on Memorial Day, which is only a couple of months away, I somehow combine state and church in some way to honor me. And to me, it always feels very unnatural. And I don't know if you have any models that work there. And the other question is there any way to honorably, without dishonoring these other people, honor those 150,000 to 600,000 people who died on the other side?
In Iraq. Yeah. To be honest, you know, I think it would be great. You know, I'm guessing there are veterans here. I think it would be great to have conversations like this every month, with nothing but let's just talk. I don't know, maybe see a movie, read a book, and see what happens. Kind of like the AA model, right? Very simple, 1 hour, you know, and then let's just see what happens. There's something about that. I'll tell you a story. When I was in Hillsborough, North Carolina, saying Mass back in my priest days, at the invasion of the Gulf War in 1991, I preached against it. After returning from Germany, counseling soldiers who were going to get deployed from Germany to the Gulf, and their applications for CO, conscientious objection, were all turned down. And they were put in handcuffs and leg irons, and they were tossed onto C-130 transport planes. And they found themselves in Riyadh, in a company under a commander as a conscientious objector. Let me tell you, it was not a good position to be in. When I came back, we started Amnesty International type letter writing campaign to the commanders of the guys who would come forward as COs to tell the commanders we were keeping track of their treatment. And the commanders, as we heard later, the commanders would go up to this kid and say, who the hell are you? Who do you know all these Mennonites in Kansas who are writing, about you, so like kid in the hood in Detroit, so the commanders are like, what the hell's going on? But it was good. They felt there was someone there. Well, I came back and told the story about these COs, and my parish in North Carolina did not like it one bit. And I don't know if I'd give the same homily now, but I didn't have any regrets. And it was measured, and it was a written text, because I thought I would get hassled. The next day, 4 calls went to the chancery, and I was criticized in the Catholic newspaper the next week. 1 out of 5 military people that were deployed in the Gulf in 1990-91 were from the state of North Carolina. Fort Bragg, Camp Lejeune, Pope Air Force Base, Seymour Johnson. So it got so bad in my little parish that the nun who was the administrator, I was just the, bring in the priest guy, because I was a grad student too, and the administrator said, you've got to face these people that they're so mad. Sister Margie, God love her, she was just like, she didn't know what to do. She was so well intended, people were so mad. So we got together. 10 days later after the homily. There's about 40 people there. We all sat in a big circle. And Charles Norgood, who was a security guy at Duke, was part of the parish. And he started talking about coming back in Vietnam. And he said he felt so, the peace movement, the anti-war. And he looks at me and he says, Father Mike, you got to promise me you'll never preach like that again. And I said, Charles, I can't promise that. You can't capture the Word of God. And we went for a walk the next week at Duke. And over the course of 6 months, we got to know and like each other. So, I don't know. So, I don't know what I'm even trying to say at this point, but just that those types of personal meeting, I'm a personalist. And those types of personal encounters are the way to go. And as much as can be done to create a very humane and personal context where people open up, I think we'll all be all to the good. People got to stick with each other. Yeah.
What are you going to be doing in Denver?
Hey, that's a good question.
What was the question?
Wait, you got a job for me?
No, but I recently started working up in Laramie, Wyoming, where the University of Wyoming is, and they have a very well-developed program for veterans and children of veterans as well. And they have I was going to show you the website. I don't know the details, but I can pass that on to you if you're interested.
This is great, and the question over here about here at CSU too. I want to do this type of thing somehow, and I guess I'm trying to use my time at DePaul to do that. And to be honest, I'm moving to Colorado, and I'm going to be a migrant worker. On Tuesdays, I'm going to fly to Chicago, and Thursdays I'm home. 30 weeks a year. I'm an academic, so I only have to work 2/3 time. But no, I'm only kidding. We write and we think, but I have thought that in Colorado there's a strong presence. I know in Denver, I've heard here, and I know in the Springs with Fort Carson and Peterson and the Academy. There's just a lot to be done that could be done, and however much is being done, and a lot of initiatives are being started. My impression is there's always more to do. Because it's personal work, and that's like labor intensive. There's a movement in the Northwest called Arms to Farms, where they're saying that the kind of healing that's needed is the kind that of life would be like growing things on a farm. Maybe come home from war, and if you say you're single, kind of unattached, pick 3 months and go to a farm. And that's an ancient image that goes back to the prophet Isaiah. They'll turn their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning. Yep.
I just recently read something, and I can't remember where it was, but it was telling about how the Japanese, after World War II, treated their soldiers who returned from war. And in essence, what they did was to bring the soldiers in front of the community, praise them lavishly. Oh, it was Richard Rohr, retiring the good soldiers. Yeah, soldiers. So you bring them in front of the community, praise them, and after much praise,
Yeah, to punctuate that time so you don't keep moving.
Yeah.
Actually, I'm looking at the guy behind you, Joachim, because we were talking about monastic life today, and it's an ancient tradition that monasteries, the returning crusaders, well, know how we're supposed to think about the Crusades, but people fought in them and they came back. And oftentimes, as part of the practice in the church, was for people to go to monasteries for 40 days. Not in punishment, but just to go. And in the Catholic Peace Fellowship, we've explored with a few monasteries. Would you be willing to take people? Think of this too. There was just a gigantic explosion of vocations in the monastic life after World War II, and a lot were veterans. That's not a coincidence. Yeah.
Something that you touched upon, and I wonder if this is also part of the challenge, and that is to provide the families of the returning veterans with some means to think about and understand. Because a lot of times they don't just come home with nightmares of kind of violence, alcoholism, etc. And a lot of times children don't understand. It take a long time to figure that out and figure some vocabulary. I'm Nate Satino's colleague, I'm a history professor, and my father was a World War II veteran, and it wasn't until I was actually trying to teach my own students about World War II and reading books with them that I finally made sense to me what happened in my family.
Right. I feel the same way. I wish now, because my dad died in 1992. And I would ask him, about this. After 20 minutes, he'd say, I don't want to talk. But there's a lot of stuff being written and so on this stuff. It's very powerful and important. You can tell, look at what we're talking about. Yeah. One more.
Let's take one more question, and before we take that, I want to invite all of you to come and continue this conversation in the fellowship hall in the back here. We have the coffee and tea and lemonade, and we can continue this conversation.
Hey, everyone knows that now, right?
Where do you see the church today? Where do you see American U.S. Catholic bishops over recent years, and maybe this new Pope Francis, in terms of the church helping us with ideas about peace and or where there may be just war?
Yeah. Couple things, a couple of vignettes. First, the churches in terms of veterans are virtually nowhere, the Catholic Church is virtually nowhere. Only starting. This needs to be happening and it's not. That's one of the things we're trying to do in the Catholic Peace Fellowship, is to instigate that. A little bit of activity in some dioceses, but not nearly enough. When I came back from Iraq, I had an encounter with Cardinal George just a couple of days after I got back, Chicago. But he came down to visit in Moreau Seminary where I was living. And he gave a talk to the seminarians, and I was in residence at the seminary. And he gave a talk on, he just was a cardinal. I'm going to just talk about whatever I want to talk about, and I was going to think it's great, and so on. And I like Cardinal George. He's a real thinker, and I like that in him. He was a philosopher at Creighton. He was department chair at Creighton for a while. And, but I said, what do you think about what's going on in Iraq, the possible invasion? And he said, well, it seems to me that the just war criteria and being attacked by unfriendly and hostile nations would mean that Saddam Hussein would certainly have warrant to go to war. That's what he said. And I said, well, so you think the United States invading would not fit the criteria? And he goes, yeah. And this is from all the seminarians. And I said, well, what do people, to your flock. And he said to me, well, what do you think I should say? And I said, I think you should say that you should refuse to participate in this war lest they sin against the natural law. Because I know he's a kind of a traditional guy. And he said, I don't know if I'd have the courage to say that. To which I responded, well, the way you stand up to the liturgists, you seem to have enough courage to do that. I wrote him a letter, followed up, and he didn't respond. I gave my talk on Iraq in Wisconsin. And afterwards, the bishop of the diocese wrote in the newspaper that the Pope's judgment on the coming invasion of Iraq, Catholics are not bound by it. That bishop's name was Raymond Burke. He eventually became Archbishop of St. Louis and refused John Kerry communion during the 2004 election. And now he's the head of the Rota, and a cardinal who was in the election just the other day. You want to say, again, why is the Pope's judgment wrong? So the church has this reflex against it, against standing up to America or refusing. But I think that this new Pope, I don't know, he's got baggage, it's all coming up and he's already. But on the other hand, I like the fact that he slipped out of the Vatican this morning and just went to a little church. And it reminds me of something that maybe this is where we could conclude. It reminds me of something Jacques Maritain said during World War II. What should the Pope have done? Right? And he said he should have gotten on a donkey and ridden it from Rome to Berlin. Right during the war. Would the John Paul II have gone to Sarajevo like Susan Sontag? Or like go to Baghdad like Kathy Breen and Kathy Kelly did? But then when we say that, well, why just them? Why not us too, right? And so that's always where we have to leave it to what can we do? And the answer is always more. But it's nice to do it together. And it's been nice to have this time together, for sure. Thanks.